Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at this idea of green for growth.
Interesting concept.
Yeah, it is, it's this whole vision for Ghana's future that combines economic progress with environmental sustainability.
Yeah. And it's a lot more than just like adding a few solar panels. You know what I mean?
Right. It is, and our main source for this deep dive is a really interesting radio podcast interview with Richmond Bash.
Of course, head of the RBG Party and, running for president.
Exactly, and he's really laying out his vision for the country.
His vision for Ghana. Yeah, and we're just trying to unpack all that. Look at what this green for growth actually means in practice,
Yeah.
and explore how it could impact different parts of life in Ghana.
Sounds good. All right, so let's jump right in. This whole green for growth thing, I get that it's about protecting the environment, but Bash keeps using this analogy of planting seeds for tomorrow's harvest.
Yeah, it's a good analogy, I think.
What do you think about it? Well, I mean, it's a nice way to emphasize that, sustainability isn't just about today, right? It's about making sure that future generations have what they need to thrive. Like you don't just harvest all your crops and then leave the land barren. You got to plant new seeds, to make sure there's a harvest in the future.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Okay, so how does this translate into something concrete, like energy? I know Ghana has a lot of sunshine, but they also have these constant power outages.
Yeah, that's a major issue. I mean, and Bash is tackling that head on.
Okay.
He's proposing a big investment in renewable energy, particularly solar power.
Okay.
And get this, he claims that for every 10 megawatts of solar power that's installed, something like 500 jobs are created.
Wow.
Manufacturing, installation, maintenance.
That's a lot of jobs.
It is. And it's not just good for the environment, it's good for the economy, too.
Yeah, that's impressive, 500 jobs. But I keep hearing from people that solar panels are really expensive. Can Ghana really afford this kind of investment?
Well, that's a common concern. And, Bash argues that the initial costs are definitely there, but you have to look at the long-term savings.
Okay.
So solar panels can really slash those energy bills over time. He even mentioned a study where one community, their energy costs went down by like 70% after switching to solar.
70%. Wow. Okay, I'm starting to see the appeal here, but what about the people who don't live in the cities?
Right.
Can solar really work in those rural areas where the power grid is unreliable?
Well, that's exactly where Bash sees solar having a huge impact.
Okay.
Imagine rural schools, clinics, farms, all powered by the sun. No more relying on these, expensive polluting generators or fossil fuels.
Yeah, I remember in the interview, a teacher even called in. She was talking about how these power cuts were constantly messing up her classes.
Oh, yeah.
What was Bash's response to that?
Yeah, he got really specific. He talked about this Power for Learning program that he wants to set up.
Okay.
Equipping schools with solar panels and battery storage so they have constant electricity.
That's incredible.
No more missed lessons because the power's out.
So we're seeing how this green for growth could impact energy, create jobs. But what about other sectors of the economy, like agriculture? I know that's a huge part of life in Ghana.
Oh, yeah, agriculture is the backbone, but it's also really vulnerable to climate change.
Right.
And Bash is talking about training farmers in these sustainable practices.
Like what kind of practices?
Like crop rotation, water-efficient irrigation, things like that.
Water-efficient irrigation, what does that even look like?
Well, it could be things like using drip irrigation systems so the water goes straight to the roots instead of spraying it everywhere.
Okay.
Or using sensors to monitor the soil.
Oh.
So you only irrigate when you absolutely need to. It's about, saving water, reducing waste.
Okay, that makes sense. You're right. Everyone needs to eat. But I have to admit, I still wonder if Ghana can really afford to go green. It seems like a luxury for wealthier countries.
That's a common thought, and Bash actually addresses that head on. He argues that ignoring climate change is the real luxury.
Okay.
And one that Ghana just can't afford. He sees this green for growth as an investment, not just an expense.
Okay.
And it's an investment that will pay off in the future.
That's an interesting way to put it. So we've talked energy, we've talked about farming. What about all the buildings in Ghana? Where does construction fit into all of this?
Now that's where things get exciting.
Okay.
In the interview, a construction worker actually called in. His name was Kwame.
Oh, wow.
And he asked Bash about that exact thing.
Cool.
And Bash talked about using these locally sourced sustainable building materials.
Okay.
Like bamboo and earth, and incorporating designs that keep buildings cool naturally so you don't need as much air conditioning.
Like those buildings you see in the magazines with like the living walls and stuff?
Yeah, it's not just about being fancy, though. It's about being smart.
Right.
Creating buildings that are good for the environment and good for the people in them.
Okay, so this green for growth thing is really starting to take shape. We're seeing how it could impact energy agriculture, how buildings are designed. But is it all on the government to make this happen?
Well,
What about everyday people?
that's a key part of Bash's message. He says every Ghanaian has a role to play,
Okay.
and that those small actions add up.
Like what?
Planting trees, reducing waste, supporting those local businesses that are, committed to sustainability.
Right.
All of that makes a difference.
And what about those people who are skeptical? Like, I know a lot of people are struggling just to make ends meet. Can we really be worried about the environment when there's all these other issues?
Yeah, Bash gets that, and he acknowledges those concerns. He argues that caring for the environment and growing the economy aren't, these separate things.
Hmm.
They can and should go together.
Okay.
And he really emphasizes that green for growth is about creating a better future for all Ghanaians.
All right, so we've laid some groundwork here. We've got a pretty good idea of what this green for growth vision is all about, at least from Bash's perspective.
At least from his perspective. Yeah,
But we're just getting started.
exactly. There's a lot more to explore.
Yeah, there is.
We need to look at the potential benefits, the challenges, and whether or not this is all really realistic.
And I'm sure you're going to be guiding us through all of that, right?
You bet. Stay with us as we continue our deep dive into green for growth.
Okay, so we've got a pretty good handle on what this green for growth is all about, at least in theory. But now let's get down to the nitty-gritty. What are the real-world benefits that Bash is actually promising here?
Well, one of the most immediate benefits he keeps bringing up is this improved access to reliable energy,
Okay.
especially for those rural communities we talked about.
Mm-hmm.
Remember Amma, the teacher who called in?
Oh, yeah, with those constant power cuts in her classroom.
Exactly. Reliable electricity could be totally transformative for places like her school. Kids can actually study without interruption.
Right.
Clinics can store vaccines properly, use life-saving equipment. Farmers can even process their crops on site so they can add value and cut down on waste.
It's like you're saying it unlocks all this potential for those communities.
Exactly.
But beyond that, I remember Bash made a big deal about how going green could actually boost Ghana's economy.
Absolutely. And he's not just talking about those 500 jobs per solar installation we mentioned,
Right.
though that's a pretty good chunk of jobs.
Yeah.
He sees a ripple effect across different sectors.
Okay, so give me an example. How does green agriculture lead to more money for the average Ghanaian?
Well, think about it. If farmers can learn these more sustainable techniques, their yields could actually increase.
Okay.
More crops, more income for them, and more food security for the whole country.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, you've got this potential for a booming ecotourism sector.
Right.
Attracting visitors from all over, bringing in foreign currency, all that, supporting local businesses.
Mhm. More money in people's pockets, food on the table, tourists enjoying Ghana's natural beauty. It sounds pretty idyllic, I have to say. But let's be real here. There have to be some downsides to this whole green for growth thing, right?
Well, of course. There are always challenges with anything new.
Sure.
And one of the biggest concerns is the upfront cost.
Okay.
Shifting to renewables, training farmers, building these eco-friendly homes, it all takes money.
That's what I was thinking. Can Ghana really afford all of this, especially when there are so many other pressing issues they have to deal with?
It's a valid question, and Bash admits that the initial investment will be substantial.
Okay.
But he really emphasizes that the long-term benefits will outweigh those costs.
Okay.
Those savings on energy bills, the potential for international funding, all of that.
Right.
He argues that ignoring climate change is actually the more expensive option in the long run.
So it's about playing the long game. Invest now and reap the rewards later. But even if it does save money in the long run, couldn't this shift to green energy leave some people behind? What about those who rely on fossil fuels for their livelihoods?
Yeah, that's a really crucial point. You've hit on it. How do we make sure this transition is fair and equitable for everyone?
Right.
How do we support those whose jobs might be affected by moving away from fossil fuels?
Exactly.
How do we make sure that the benefits of renewable energy reach every Ghanaian, not just the wealthy or those in the cities?
Yeah, I was reading an article the other day about how some of those large-scale solar or wind farms have been criticized for displacing communities or disrupting wildlife habitats.
Exactly. We have to be mindful of the potential downsides, even with these well-intentioned green initiatives.
Right.
Environmental justice needs to be part of the equation. It's not just about reducing emissions. It's about making sure everyone benefits from a healthier planet.
So it's not as simple as just slapping solar panels on everything and calling it a day.
Nope, definitely not.
What about relying on foreign aid to fund these green initiatives? Does that create a different set of problems?
That's the dependency dilemma, right?
Yeah.
Attracting international investment can help jumpstart things,
Yeah.
but you have to be careful about becoming too reliant on outside sources.
Right. What happens if that funding dries up or there are strings attached?
Exactly. Ghana needs to develop its own capacity to drive the sustainable future, not just rely on handouts.
Okay, so we've got the cost, the potential for inequality, the reliance on foreign aid. Anything else we should be worried about?
Well, anytime you're talking about big projects and large sums of money, there's always that risk of corruption.
Oh yeah. How do we make sure that the money that's meant for this green for growth actually gets used for that purpose?
That's where good governance and transparency come in,
Mm.
holding leaders accountable.
Mm.
Citizens need to be informed and engaged and making sure their voices are heard.
So this is where Bash's call for individual action really comes into play.
Absolutely. It's not just about the government implementing policies. It's about people demanding transparency, participating in the process, and pushing for that sustainable future.
But let's be honest, there's a lot of skepticism out there. Some people think this whole green for growth thing is just a ploy to appease Western donors or score political points.
Sure.
How do we separate the hype from reality?
That's where critical thinking is so important.
Okay.
You can't just accept every politician's promise at face value.
Right.
Look at the track records, consider who benefits from different policies, and don't be afraid to ask tough questions.
So question everything, even the stuff that sounds good.
Especially the stuff that sounds good.
Okay.
We're talking about really complex issues. There were going to be trade-offs, unintended consequences,
Yeah.
different opinions on how to move forward.
So how do we as listeners navigate this complex landscape? It's starting to feel like a political minefield out there.
Well, that's where understanding the political context is really important. So let's dig into how this Green for Growth vision fits into the bigger picture of Ghanaian politics.
All right, so we've talked about the potential benefits, the challenges, but let's not forget that this is all happening within a specific political context, right? Bash and his RBG party, they're really making this Green for Growth thing their big campaign promise.
Yeah, they're definitely trying to own this issue, positioning themselves as the champions of sustainable development.
Right.
But, Ghana has a multi-party system, and there are other voices out there with different ideas about how to achieve progress.
So what are some of the other perspectives? Is everyone on board with this Green for Growth vision?
Well, not everyone. Some critics say it's all a bit too idealistic,
Okay.
and that it doesn't really address the immediate needs of everyday Ghanaians.
What do you mean?
Well, they point to things like poverty, unemployment, lack of basic infrastructure as more urgent priorities.
It's like saying, hey, I'm more worried about putting food on the table today than saving the planet for tomorrow.
Exactly. And then there are those who question whether Ghana can really afford to go green, without sacrificing economic growth.
Right there.
They worry that focusing too much on the environment could slow down industrial development and job creation.
So it's a balancing act. How do you pursue sustainability without holding back economic progress?
Right. And then there's another layer of critique.
Okay.
Some folks see this whole green for growth thing as a way to just attract foreign aid,
Okay.
win favor with Western countries.
It's all about appearances.
Yeah, they claim it's more about looking good than actually making a real commitment to sustainable development.
So how do we as engaged citizens sort through all these different viewpoints and figure out what to believe?
Well, that's where critical thinking is so important.
Yeah.
Don't just take everything at face value.
Yeah.
Do your own research. Look at who benefits from these different policies. And don't be afraid to ask those tough questions.
Don't just take things at face value. So if we step back from the politics for a minute, what's the key takeaway for the average Ghanaian listening to all of this? What should they be thinking about?
Well, I think it comes down to this thing. The future of Ghana is going to be shaped by the choices that its people make.
Okay.
Whether it's through their votes, their actions, their everyday choices, or the pressure they put on their leaders. Citizens have the power to really steer the country in a direction that reflects their values.
So it's not just about listening to what politicians are saying, it's about actually engaging and demanding action.
Exactly. And remember, there's no one perfect solution.
Right.
It's about finding that balance between economic development, environmental protection, social justice. It's a complicated equation, but one that every Ghanaian has a stake in solving.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Green for Growth, what's the one thing you want our listeners to walk away with?
I think it's this, whether you agree with Bash's vision or not, this conversation has brought up some really important questions about what kind of future we want for Ghana. And those are questions that are worth thinking about, debating, and ultimately acting on.
Couldn't agree more. This deep dive is just the starting point.
Right.
So keep learning, keep questioning, keep pushing for the changes you want to see.
Absolutely.
And let's build a future for Ghana that's both prosperous and sustainable.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Green for Growth. We'll see you next time.